Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. I'm your host, Diehl. I am currently the Vice President of the Interreligious Council of Linn County. On this morning's show, we're going to talk about an extremely important topic, and that is the age of misinformation. And so I have three excellent guests with me this morning. And I'd like for you, before we jump into this topic, just to take a few seconds to tell the audience who you are and why this particular topic is important to you.
Right. I'm Megan Goldberg. I'm an assistant professor of politics at Cornell College. So when I teach American politics classes, this is especially important, especially recently, but I've also worked a lot on misinformation in my own research and on research in graduate school. This was mostly during the Obama administration, and misinformation has only sort of increased in prevalence and magnitude since then. So I think this is an especially important topic.
All right. Thank you.
My name is Chris Hoklotubbe. I'm an assistant professor of religion at Cornell College. And I just actually finished teaching a class with Megan on religion and politics, wherein we talked about the correlation between the spread of information, in particular, the stories connected to QAnon and anti-vaccination with relation to the coronavirus, and the high prevalence of these conspiracy theories among white evangelicals and those who believe that America is and should be a Christian nation, what we might call Christian nationalism. This is particularly interesting to me and a personal worth because I myself come from an evangelical tradition. And I'm curious to understand the high prevalency of these kinds of conspiracy theories, even among my own family.
Thank you, Chris.
And I'm the other Chris. I'm a physician in the Iowa City area. I'm a former candidate for Congress, also small business owner here. I'm also serving as the state coordinator for a group called Braver Angels in Iowa, which seeks to promote civil discourse and reduce political polarization. I have been interested in misinformation before I even really probably knew the term as a physician, when people try and curbside me about things that I don't really know much about. And then Dr. Google has become the expert now, so you have to refute everything you find online. And more recently, of course, in the political sphere, which is what I think we're going to focus on here.
Absolutely. So again, thank you for joining. So I think it comes as no surprise that this topic of misinformation is something that everybody's talking about in light of all kinds of recent events that have taken place. And I want to kind of set the table here a little bit before we dive into the topic. And that is to kind of first define what we're talking about when we use the term misinformation. So just doing a very quick and easy Wikipedia search, we find that misinformation is false or inaccurate information that is communicated regardless of an intention to deceive. Under that is disinformation, which is a type of misinformation that is deliberately deceptive. The principal effect of misinformation is to elicit fear and suspicion amongst a population. So to be clear, we're not talking about a right or left issue, right? This isn't something that is, just those people that are on the right side of the political aisle are guilty of, or those that are on the left side are guilty of. This is certainly a human problem that we have. And I want to start by kind of talking about why is it arguably a bigger problem today than it's ever been. So I'd like one of you to jump in and talk about what are some of the unique things we face as a society when it comes to combating misinformation.
So I can jump in first. I think that there's lots of cognitive biases that we have that lead us or that make us susceptible to misinformation. But those are things that have always been true, right? Those cognitive biases are not worse suddenly. But one of the things that I think we can point to that is worse is polarization. And one thing that makes those cognitive biases that make us susceptible to information even stronger is anger. And with polarization has come a lot of anger. And polarization has turned into this thing, not just that we disagree and our opinions are really different, but that we have really negative emotions about sort of the other side. And that makes us more susceptible to misinformation about especially our political opponents. So I think that's one thing that has changed that we can sort of pinpoint as one of the causes.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, Megan, that, because we live in this very polarized society, that kind of amplifies either our consumption or the spread of misinformation. So that's not something I really thought of before, and it's an excellent point. Chris, either of the Chris's, do you want to jump in on that and talk about why you feel we need to become even more, even better at fighting misinformation in today's world?
I'll jump in and then I'll let the first Chris speak. The other thing I would point out that I think is new is just technology. And our information sources are much less centralized than they were for example, when I was growing up. And so if you want to find some alternative piece of information or something that reinforces your beliefs, it's easy to find. And sites are out there. They enjoy getting your clicks and your likes and your retweets. They like your ad revenue as well. So our technology has made it much easier to acquire and spread misinformation.
Yeah. Well, I should have jumped in first because that's what I was going to say. But I will add that this seems especially urgent because people have and are acting out in violent ways as a result of misinformation. Right. A few years ago, there was Pizzagate, where somebody was led to believe that there was a child sex trafficking ring in a Washington, D.C. pizza joint and went in there with a gun, ready to shoot at the place to free these children. Little did he know there were no children there except for the ones he terrorized, and was promptly arrested. And then most notably, January 6th, the siege on the Capitol that was largely led by those who followed QAnon, which is a very popular conspiracy theory that largely tells this narrative that Donald Trump is the savior who is going to drain the swamp to bring to light this broad pedophile ring that is led by Democrats, including Hillary Clinton, as well as celebrities, and throw in a touch of cannibalism and draining kids' blood so that you can live forever. And this makes a really compelling story. But again, to touch base or to connect this with Megan's point, this touches on deep feelings of anger and deep feelings of victimization and almost to apocalyptic proportions where there's such great belief in some of this misinformation that people will go to great lengths, even if it involves violence, to be on the good side, to be the heroes in their narrative.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Chris. So a couple of things we picked up on here, right? That there's a unique situation we find ourselves in with social media, the technology, the ability to consume and spread the information rapidly, kind of our psychological bug that we have, right? Which is to consume information that we feel aligns with the way in which we view the world. And then kind of the anger associated with it, which amplifies our reaction. So again, that's consistent with some of the research I've done on some of the research that's been done, which is we love to share stories that are consistent with our way of looking at the world, right? Like whether that be a political position, a religious belief, any social issue. And then again, as I stated earlier, this isn't a conservative or liberal issue. This is a human issue. So how do we, to kind of get into this, how do we try to overcome let's take the issue of consuming information that aligns with our particular way of looking at the world, whether that be political, religious, etc. How do we kind of step back from that and apply some rationality that helps us get closer to the truth and combat the spread of misinformation? And Megan, maybe you want to jump in on that.
Yeah, so I think that there are some things you can do as an individual. But I think one of the most important things is recognizing that a lot of what we say out there as misinformation is in fact disinformation. This is misinformation that is purposefully spread, whether it's for monetary gain or political gain. And so we need to start holding people, institutions who spread misinformation deliberately, who are spreading disinformation, start to hold them accountable. And I think, one thing that we didn't really talk about with the prevalence is that we're starting to see more and more misinformation spreading from our elected officials, right? So Chris talked about QAnon. There are at least 2 members of Congress who are adherents to QAnon, who express belief in at least some of their theories, if not all. And that's extremely problematic. We also have, elected officials who have repeated claims that we know are just not true. And right, there's all sorts of politicians lying is like an American tradition, like for a lot of people. But I think that has gotten much more severe in a way that's undermining a lot of democratic norms and things like that. So one of the first steps is, individual action is good and it's important, but it's also really important to start to hold elected officials, to hold media institutions accountable for disinformation.
So I will start too. Again, I will continue on, right? Like it feels so good to be right. It feels so good to know that other people are dumb or worser than you, right? And that's what a lot of misinformation feeds into, right? That, you're self-justified with your hatred of Obama because he really shouldn't be president because he's born in Kenya. Or I'm really not liking Trump, and I know that like Melania Trump is doing all what she can to undermine him, and secretly is going to get a divorce, right? Like there have been a number of stories that are cited by unsourced people, right? That just feel good to believe in, right? And what we have to check in ourselves, right, is I think one thing is we have to slow down when we consume media, right? And studies have shown that when we read something, we slow down, right, before we hit that click, right, before we click on that clickbait article, you won't believe this. Obama said this, or Trump said this outrageous thing, right? Just slow down. Is this click worth your click, right, from the headline? But also, as you think through the story, where is the story coming from? What's its sources? What are the evidences that it's using from? Like, is this vaccination technique for COVID coming from a doctor or a YouTube personality or a Twitter celebrity, right? What are their credentials for saying this and their evidence? And this ties into Chris Peters' point that we are in this rich democratization of technology age where anyone can post anything and claim to be an expert on stuff. And it takes extra work on our part to look into those claims, to check out whether or not they are indeed experts. And so,
Chris, if I can jump in, I mean, there's, I think we point to things like social media a lot as sort of boogeymen when it comes to misinformation, but this democratization has also, especially during the pandemic, I think has revealed the possibilities of social media. So this is just like personal anecdotes, but there's lots of epidemiologists, science comm people out there who are doing there's some former journalists who are doing a really, really good job distilling information for the public where they feel like other media sources are sort of lacking. And they're doing an amazing job. You see these people have hundreds of thousands of followers. And they're graduate students or, they're professionals and they're doing this in their spare time. And something like social media has made that possible in a way that wouldn't have been possible, a decade ago. So it's figuring out, who are the real experts here. And sort of, maybe you have to learn a little bit about credentials. You have to learn a little bit about the subject area. And so it requires a little bit of investment on your part as well.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point. And Chris Peters, I'd like you to jump in here. I was reading an article here just this morning on that the mistrust in institutions, American institutions specifically, then that could be colleges, everything, right? Pretty much government, you name it, mistrust. And this is kind of a domino effect, right? Or a snowball effect, I would say, that when you see some of your elected leaders or officials or, CEOs or whatever the case may be, or doctors or credentialed people like you're talking about, Megan, who have been caught in a lie or who have blatantly lied or who have blatantly spread what we call disinformation, people become skeptical about, well, how pervasive is this, right? If this person who holds this much power and has this much exposure has no problem spreading misinformation, or even when there are consequences. There's probably this human tendency to think that this is pervasive, and maybe the bet is to not trust anyone. And so we find ourselves maybe in that situation right now. So Chris Peters, how do institutions, how do these places that we should trust, right, and we rely on to give us good information about how the world is working and does work, how do they go about restoring the trust?
Yeah, I'd say, first of all, be always worthy of that trust. We have seen in the medical field and the social science research, we have seen examples of people fabricating research, for example, or manipulating the data. But by and large, I think that's a very small fraction of what actually happens. We have other problems with our research regarding how things get published. But most people that go into the fields of research, go into research, and regardless of their field, go into it with good intentions of actually learning new truths and passing those along to others. One of the things that, when I look at medical research, for example, we look at things like not only whether the author is authoritative, whether they came from a good institution, but really importantly is there confirmation from other studies that show similar things. So, and that's something I think we don't tend to do very often when it comes to the kind of stuff we're talking about here, political, social misinformation, is verifying sources, going to sources that we normally might not look at. I think we tend to emotionally choose the things we want to believe, and then we use our rationality to justify those beliefs. And so it's very easy to be readily accepting of a source or something that's telling you what you want to hear, and overly skeptical sometimes of the thing that goes against what you want to believe. I think it's important to try and reverse that when you can, is maybe be a little overly skeptical of the stuff that agrees with what you believe, and try to find areas of agreement with sources that maybe go against what you want to believe.
Yeah, excellent points. And I love what you guys are saying, this idea of slowing down, this idea, Chris, that you had made in the conversation we had earlier, Chris Hoklotubbe, that, if a story seems too good or too bad to be true, it's probably not. And so, just kind of stepping back and letting yourself just calm down and think rationally through it, I think will help us all. A point, and I want to switch gears here and spend maybe a bit amount of time here. And I can imagine, as Chris Hoklotubbe, you made the point earlier, not in this show, but in a prior conversation I had with you, that it really does require everybody to combat misinformation. I think the term you used was you encouraged the ands, something along that line of, it's the consumer's responsibility, and it's our leaders' responsibility, and it's the big tech's responsibility, on and on and on. So, one of the big things we're talking about with misinformation is, yes, it is everybody's responsibility. But the question, of course, comes up immediately as you have these conversations as I have. Is it big tech's responsibility to, quote unquote, suppress a person's free speech? Do they know what's misinformation, what isn't? And, certainly when you begin to do that, as seen with the big tech companies such as Twitter and Facebook and so forth, that there's this, tremendous backlash that we're now seeing our free speech suppressed, even though it may be for good purposes or response to some of the violent acts we saw committed here in the last couple of weeks. So where is is there a slippery slope? Is there an argument to be made that these big tech companies shouldn't be doing this, and that they need the misinformation just needs to be combated by good information and let it all just kind of come out in the wash eventually? So what are your thoughts? And I'll let anybody jump in on that, but we're talking about who should be responsible for managing this online content.
So I can jump in. I think that there are arguments out there that I think make a lot of sense. Arguing to start regulating things like Twitter and Facebook as public utilities. And I think that some of those arguments make a lot of sense, but for the moment, that's not how they're treated. But I also think it's important to point out that there are, as someone, I consider myself a free speech advocate. I think free speech is incredibly, incredibly important. but there are limits on free speech, that have been upheld by the courts, right? You cannot shout fire in a crowded theater. And so that's sort of some of the arguments that we're seeing, that the things that were out there on Twitter, on Facebook, were arguably doing that. They were calling for violence. And I've seen that in my own, I grew up in a place that was very conservative. So I see that from friends from high school and college, who, are essentially promoting violence after the election. That's akin to, even if, let's like put a thought experiment for a second, even if Facebook was, a governmental entity, that a governmental entity would be, they would still be abiding by our constitutional right to free speech, by regulating some of that or by prohibiting some of that speech.
Yeah, the argument is that, these are private companies and they don't necessarily have to allow you to say anything you want, wherever you want to say it, however you want to say it, right? Which does make sense for sure. Certainly, we've moved probably beyond, are they specifically promoting violence? I think what we've seen here is that the misinformation itself has led to a violent reaction. So using the case of January 6th, Trump's speech on January 6th, in which he, doubled down on this idea that the election was stolen, that it was, one of the worst atrocities in human history, and that it was, and I'm not quoting, but, in context, and that, and then kind of continue to reiterate what have proven to be false claims around massive voter fraud. And so, we've seen now these big tech companies have said, okay, we have got to suppress this misinformation around the election because it is now leading to violence. Again, people are going to argue, well, where does that end, right? Can you interpret that in all kinds of ways to say, well, your claim to this is going to lead to violence, therefore you can't say it. So what is your thought there on that, again, slippery slope argument? Either of the Chris's can jump in.
Who wants to get the most hate mail, Chris?
Go for it. We're in deep water. Go for it.
Are you trying to say
I'm off. I got it. Sorry about that. I always like to point out that, this technology we're dealing with is a new toy. We haven't really figured out how to use it very well. I think we are still learning how to do that. It'll be an evolving process. I do agree that there are limits to speech. We're not talking about free speech, of course, when Facebook or Twitter bans somebody. That's not the government doing that. So it's not a free speech argument or violating free speech argument. But I will point out that, is it Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, released yesterday or today saying he thought what the banning Trump on Twitter was the right thing to do, but he did have reservations about where that goes. So, again, I think we'll probably figure this out in time, but it's going to take some time to get there.
Yeah, I think, to jump on to what Chris just said, this is extremely new. I had a class actually do an assignment analyzing Trump's tweets, and they compared it to tweets from the Obama administration. And as we got further along into the Trump presidency, the assignment was obsolete because Trump had so many more tweets than Obama, and used it entirely differently. And so I think this is incredibly new, that Trump is really the first president to rely on social media as his main form of communication. And so this is genuinely very, very new space for politics to be in.
And of course, no one wants to curb free speech, right? That this is like a pillar of our democracy. And so, yeah, I think any ban, any censorship is inherently a slippery slope. But, in some ways we are reacting. We already have evidence that this misinformation has caused violence, and we have a huge inauguration on January 20th, right? And so I think companies are taking extraordinary measures right now to be on the safe side. And once we're past the inauguration, I imagine there will be cooler minds will prevail, and freedom of speech will keep going. I think also that on Twitter, right? Twitter also banned 70,000 accounts that were also connected to QAnon, whether temporarily suspended or permanently banned, right? And again, right, like there's a difference between temporary suspension, right? you can come back, you can, slap on the wrist, and then there's like the permanent silence ban.
So we just have excellent points here made by all. So we have just a few minutes left. I want to talk, and it's already been touched on a little bit here, but I want to talk about what are the benefits of combating misinformation, right? So we've talked about, well, it's going to, in some instances, avoid violence, which is obviously everything we want. Everybody wants to avoid that. But what are some other things that we should, as a society, really say, hey, listen, there's a real benefit here of not allowing misinformation, and we'll figure out how to best identify it. But what are some benefits that we can think of to combating it and keeping it to a minimum?
I mean, I think first and foremost is when we're talking about political misinformation, is that you can't have democratic accountability without good information. So, I mean, just think about pandemic-related policies. If you want to hold the state government, if you want to hold the governor or your state representative, or you want to hold national representatives accountable for how well they've mitigated the consequences, and you don't have accurate information, how do you do that, right? Like that democratic linkage is broken without good information.
I would add too that I think right now we're seeing a lot of tensions within families. I already mentioned my own, right? But my own wife got off on a call with her aunt, who was asking her about this insurrection and asking her about the presidency. And you said, Trump, this whole election was stolen from Trump, and it deeply saddened my wife. I feel like families are being torn apart, relationships are being torn apart. So there is a social cost, a family cost to misinformation. I will add to that, though, it is really hard to persuade someone away from misinformation and conspiratorial theory, right? And studies have shown that you can present stats and you can present good data and source information, and that will be met with brick walls, right? Because when we are told stories that contradict the stories we tell ourselves, we experience this as a fight or flight, right? Someone is attacking me. And so despite all this conversation about misinformation, right, my 2 cents of this is pretty blasé. Like we need to love people and ask different kinds of questions when we come up against misinformation, right? Questions like, why is this compelling to you? How do you feel that you're threatened by the establishment, or how ask more questions. And
yep.
That's, I'll pass off to Chris Peters because we're running out of time.
Yep. Excellent point. We all have a vested interest. Chris Peters, thoughts you have on, how does it benefit society to address misinformation?
Well, I was going to say, so I stole from Chris H earlier, so he stole from me now. That's fair. I lost a childhood friend last week over stuff on social media related to the what happened at the Capitol. But I was going to say, this is what Braver Angels does, the organization I work for. So we really try to bring people together, not to yell at each other about different sets of facts, but just to connect. And if you connect with somebody on a personal level, you can begin to at least understand them. You may not change your views, and that's fine, but you can at least begin to open a dialogue. And that's the beginning of how we fix this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. We're at a critical time in our country's history, right, of being divided. And we really do have to work together to find some common ground. And in large part, that's valuing what is true and promoting that. And so, again, I really appreciate all of you, your expertise here, your perspective. I think it was a wonderful conversation. Hopefully our listeners thought the same. I hope our audience has a great Sunday morning and the rest of your week. Take care now.